then, as if she had felt it, she turned her head, her eyes meeting mine from across the room. A slow smile curved the corner of her lips, not playful, not teasing, but something knowing. I swallowed hard, quickly looking away, but it was too late, because now I couldn't stop thinking about it. I spent the entire evening trying to act normal, forcing my attention elsewhere, trying to engage in conversation. But every time I glanced in Vivian's direction, she was already looking at me. Not, obviously not, in a way anyone else would notice, but in a way that felt heavy, charged, deliberate. It was unbearable, and yet I couldn't pull away from it. At some point I excused myself to the kitchen, needing a moment to breathe, to collect myself, to remind myself that I was being ridiculous. I leaned against the counter, pressing my palms against the cool marble, exhaling slowly, telling myself that I was imagining things, that she wasn't really looking at me like that it was just my own thoughts betraying me. But then, before I could fully regain control of myself, she walked in behind me. I didn't hear her footsteps. I didn't realize she had followed me, but then suddenly, I felt it, the warmth of her presence, the shift in the air, and then her hand. A soft barely there touched the small of my back. I went completely still. Are you all right? Her voice was quiet, low, like she knew exactly what she was doing to me. I swallowed hard, keeping my eyes fixed on the countertop, willing myself to focus on anything other than the way my body was so aware of her touch, of the heat seeping through the thin fabric of my dress. Yeah, I managed, though my voice sounded far away, like it didn't belong to me. She didn't pull away. If anything, I could feel her stepping closer, just barely, just enough for me to notice, just enough for me to wonder if I was losing my mind. Are you sure? She murmured, and I felt her breath against my skin, warm and distracting, sending a shiver down my spine. I finally turned my head to slow, too hesitant, but when I met her gaze, it was already waiting for me. Her eyes searched mine as if she were looking for something, as if she needed confirmation of something neither of us had said out loud. Something flickered in her expression, something that made my pulse slam against my ribs. And then, just as the moment stretched to long, as my breath caught in my throat, she stepped back. But it was just enough to make it clear that whatever was happening, she was giving me the choice to stop it. I should have walked away. I should have let it go, but I didn't, and she knew I wouldn't. The moment passed, yet it didn't. The tension didn't ease. It only thickened, lingering in the air between us, settling into my skin, into my thoughts. And then, as if nothing had happened, she exhaled and turned toward the cabinet, casually reaching for something. I actually meant to bring something for you, she said, so smoothly, so effortlessly, like her touch hadn't just completely unraveled me. A small gift, but I left it at my new place. I blinked, needing a second to catch up to whatever game we were playing. I licked my lips, my voice unsteady. Oh, you didn't have to get me anything. She glanced at me over her shoulder, her lips tilting into something unreadable. I wanted to, and just like that, the tension doubled. I could feel it in the way she said it, in the way her voice lowered just slightly, in the way my stomach clenched in a way I didn't understand. I should have left it at that. I should have smiled and walked away, but I didn't. Instead, before I could even think, I heard myself say, I could come with you to get it. It's not that far, right? Because I didn't know anything about her new place. The words were out before I could take them back, and I saw it, the barest flicker of something behind her eyes, something like surprise, something like anticipation, something that made my entire body feel too warm, too restless, too alive. And then she smiled, a slow, easy, dangerous smile. No, she said, her voice light, but something deeper laced beneath it, something that made my pulse stutter. Not far at all. And that was it. That was how it happened. A simple suggestion, an effortless agreement. But I should have known nothing about. This was simple, and as we stepped out of the house together with my mother, completely oblivious, with the cool night air wrapping around us, I had no idea that I was about to step into something I could never take back. The drive to Vivian's house was quiet, but it wasn't the comfortable kind of silence. It was thick, heavy, stretched tight between us like an invisible thread waiting to snap. I could feel her presence next to me, the way her fingers gripped the steering wheel a little too firmly, the way her eyes stayed locked on the road, yet seemed too aware of me sitting beside her. I should have said something. I should have made small talk, asked about this so-called gift she had left behind, anything to break the unbearable tension pressing down on us. But I didn't, because deep down, I knew this wasn't about the gift. This was about something else, something neither of us had put into words, but had felt growing between us for weeks. When we pulled into her driveway, she killed the engine, but for a long moment she didn't move. Neither did I. Then she let out a slow breath and turned to me, her eyes dark in the dim glow of the street lights. "Come inside," she said, her voice softer than usual, but with an undertone of something more. Something that made my stomach tighten. I nodded, unable to trust my own voice, and followed her up the steps, my heart pounding harder with every step. The moment she unlocked the door and we stepped inside, something shifted. It wasn't a physical change. The room looked the same, smelled the same, familiar, yet distant. But the air was different. The second the door clicked shut behind us, the tension that had been simmering between us didn't just return. It intensified. It was just us now, no distractions. No one to walk and no one to pull us apart. I stood near the entrance, unsure what to do, unsure if I should turn and run before it was too late, but Vivian was already moving. She shrugged off her coat, draping it over the back of a chair. And when she turned back to me, her expression had changed. She was watching me now, not casually, not in passing, but with something raw, something knowing. I swallowed hard, my body frozen under the weight of her gaze. She took a step forward, then another, and then she was standing in front of me, so close I could feel her warmth, could smell that subtle perfume that had started to drive me crazy. Her fingers reached up slowly, carefully, giving me a chance to stop this, and she traced a light touch along the side of my arm, barely there, but enough to make me shudder. "I should stop," she murmured, though her voice held no conviction. I could barely breathe. "Then why aren't you?" Her lips parted slightly and something in her eyes snapped before I could think. Before I could talk myself out of it, she reached for me, not hesitantly, not cautiously, but hungrily. Her hands were on my waist, pulling me against her, and her lips crashed into mine with a force that knocked the breath from my lungs. I gasped into the kiss, my fingers grasping onto her arms, clutching, holding, pulling her closer. I had never been kissed like this before. This wasn't soft. This wasn't gentle. This was all-consuming, desperate, like something that had been denied for too long, and was now unstoppable. Her hands roamed over me, exploring, discovering, like she had been waiting for this moment for longer than I could imagine. She pressed me back, my spine hitting the wall, and her mouth moved down to my neck, her lips hot and open against my skin. I let out a shaky breath, gripping onto her harder, feeling myself come undone beneath her touch. "You don't know how long I've wanted this," she murmured against my jaw, her voice thick with something I had never heard from her before: need, longing, restraint. I always thought my mother's best friend, Aunt Vivian, saw me as nothing more than a kid, someone she had watched grow. But that night, when we did that, it changed everything. I had always known Vivian Laurent. She had been there for as long as I could remember, seamlessly woven into the fabric of my life like a fixture of my childhood, a constant presence at birthdays, family dinners, and lazy Sunday afternoons when she and my mother would sit in the kitchen laughing over cups of coffee. She was my mother's best friend, her confidant, the woman who had been around for years, yet I had never really seen her, at least not like this. Moving back home after college was supposed to be temporary, just a way to regroup before figuring out what came next. I had expected familiarity, the comfort of my old room, the ease of slipping back into my mother's company. But I hadn't expected her. I hadn't expected to notice things about her I had never noticed before. Hadn't expected the way her presence would suddenly feel so different, so sharp, so undeniable. It wasn't as if Vivian had changed. If anything, she was exactly the same, poised, confident, always carrying herself with an effortless grace, always dressed in a way that made it seem like she had just stepped out of an elegant magazine spread. She still smelled like jasmine, and something subtle yet intoxicating still had that smooth, deep voice that made everything she said sound more important than it probably was. And yet there was something new, or maybe something that had always been there but had only just started making itself known to me. It started small, a look held for a fraction of a second too long, a touch that lingered at the small of my back when she passed by me in the kitchen, a shift in her expression when she caught me staring, a moment too late to look away. I told myself I was imagining things, that my mind was playing tricks on me, that I was just overwhelmed by being back home, surrounded by people and places that suddenly felt unfamiliar in their familiarity. But the feeling persisted, creeping into my thoughts at the most unexpected moments, settling into the pit of my stomach like something I couldn't shake no matter how hard I tried. And the more I noticed, the harder it became to ignore. One evening she came over for dinner, just like she always had, slipping through the front door with a bottle of wine in hand, greeting my mother with a warm smile before turning to me. Her eyes lingered for just a second, just long enough to make my pulse quicken, just long enough to make me wonder if I had imagined it. But then she smiled, smooth and effortless, and I suddenly didn't know what to do with myself. I busied myself with setting the table, pretending I wasn't hyper aware of her presence, pretending I didn't feel the weight of her gaze as she leaned against the kitchen counter chatting with my mother. Her voice was easy, casual, but my skin prickled every time she spoke. And when I turned my head just slightly, I found her watching me, not just looking, watching. And that was when I knew I wasn't imagining it. That realization sat heavy in my chest, and I wasn't sure whether it made me nervous or thrilled or something in between, something neither of us were acknowledging, something neither of us were saying out loud. But it was there, thickening the air between us, turning the simple act of sitting across from her at the dinner table into something that felt far more dangerous than it should have. She was my mother's best friend. She had known me since I was a kid. This wasn't supposed to be happening, and yet when she reached for the wine glass, her fingers brushing against mine for the briefest of moments, she didn't pull away immediately. She held my gaze instead, something flickering in her expression, something I didn't understand yet, something that made my breath catch in my throat. And then just like that, she turned back to the conversation, as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't just left me sitting there with my heart pounding and my thoughts spiraling. But there was something there, and I wasn't sure how much longer we could keep pretending otherwise. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was nothing, that I was reading too much into things, that Vivian was just naturally graceful, effortlessly charming, and knowingly alluring. I convinced myself that whatever I was feeling was just a result of being back home, of everything in my life, feeling uncertain, of being too aware of myself in a way I hadn't been before. But ignoring it didn't work, because she was always there. She was always around, slipping in and out of our house as if she belonged there, as if she had every right to weave herself into my life like she always had. And maybe she did, maybe it was me who had changed, not her. But if she had changed nothing, then why did it feel like everything was different? I noticed the way she looked at me, not just casually, not just in passing, but in a way that made my breath hitch. That made me feel like I was standing too close to an open flame. It was subtle, but it was there. And then there were the touches. They weren't obvious, they weren't inappropriate, but they were felt. A hand at my lower back guiding me out of the way in the kitchen, a brush of fingers when she passed me a glass, the whisper of her breath against my ear when she leaned in to tell me something, her voice low, deliberate, knowing. I wasn't sure if it was deliberate or if I was just imagining things. But the more I tried to push the feeling away, the more it persisted and the more it built. One evening it happened again, a small thing, something that should have meant nothing, but the way it happened made my stomach twist into knots. I was standing in the hallway flipping through a book I had left on the table when I heard her voice behind me. "You always used to love that one," she murmured, too close, too near, her voice laced with something I couldn't place. I turned, startled by her proximity, only to find her already reaching toward me. Her hand came up to tuck a loose strand of my hair behind my ear, her fingertips grazing my skin for just a second too long. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, my pulse hammering against my ribs. And she saw it. I knew she did, because her lips parted slightly, her eyes darkening for just a flicker of a second before she pulled her hand away. But the damage was already done. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of her touch, couldn't stop myself from replaying the moment over and over, from wondering if I was losing my mind, or if something had shifted between us that neither of us could take back. So I did the only thing I could think of. So I started to avoid her. I stopped lingering in the kitchen when she was over, stopped engaging in conversation, made excuses to leave the room whenever she was near. I told myself that if I just put enough space between us, whatever this was would go away, that it would stop haunting me, consuming me, making me question things I had no right to question. But the thing about denying something that already exists is that it only makes it stronger. The more I avoided her, the more I felt her absence. And every time I glanced up and found her looking at me from across the room, her expression unreadable but heavy, I knew that whatever was happening between us was real, and it wasn't going away. I didn't know what It meant I didn't know what she was thinking, but I did know that this was leading to something, whether I was ready for it or not, and soon I wouldn't be able to run from it. But little did I know there was much yet to come. The house was buzzing with warmth and conversation, the scent of home-cooked food filling the air as my mother's friends gathered in the dining room, clinking glasses and exchanging laughter. I had been through countless dinner parties like this growing up, but tonight felt different. Or maybe it wasn't the night that was different. Maybe it was just her. Vivian had arrived late, just as my mother was finishing up in the kitchen. Her entrance as effortlessly smooth as always. But the moment she stepped into the room, everything shifted, or at least it did for me. I caught sight of her from across the room and my breath faltered. She had always been beautiful, always carried herself with an elegance that was both natural and deliberate, but tonight it was more than that. Maybe it was the dim glow of the candles, maybe it was the way her dress hugged her figure in a way that commanded attention, or maybe it was the fact that I had spent weeks trying to avoid her only to find that absence had made everything feel even heavier. Now she was wearing a fitted black dress, something sleek, something that made her impossibly striking, something that shouldn't have made my stomach tighten the way it did. Her hair was swept back, exposing the delicate slope of her neck, the bare skin of her shoulders, and I found myself staring longer than I should have, longer than I could justify, and, breaking all at once, I shivered, my fingers tangling in her hair, pulling her back up to me because I needed more. Her lips crashed into mine again, this time slower, deeper, her tongue parting my lips with aching precision, her body pressing me harder against the wall until there was no space left between us. Her hands slid under my jacket, pushing it off my shoulders, letting it fall to the floor with a soft thud. She didn't stop there. She didn't hesitate. Her fingers found the hem of my shirt, slipping beneath the fabric, trailing up, touching bare skin in a way that made me tremble against her. And when I arched into her touch, she groaned against my mouth, a deep, raw sound that sent fire straight through me. "This is wrong," she whispered, even as her fingers moved higher, even as her hands explored me with a hunger that betrayed her words. I shook my head, my breaths coming fast. "No," I whispered, "it's not." That was all it took. Whatever final restraint she had left shattered. She gripped my hips, lifting me up, guiding my legs around her waist, carrying me effortlessly through the dimly lit house as her lips never left mine. I barely knew where we were going. I barely cared. All I knew was that I wanted this. I wanted her. We barely made it to the bedroom before she was pressing me down against the sheets, her body covering mine, her hands urgent, greedy, demanding in a way that sent shivers racing down my spine. Her weight pinned me beneath her, her breath hot against my skin, and I could feel the way she was holding back, restraining herself, as if even now she was still battling whatever line we had already crossed. But I didn't want her to hold back. "Vivian," I whispered, and that was all it took. She groaned low and deep, and then her lips were on mine again, hungrier this time, her tongue sliding past my lips as her fingers traced slow, tortuous patterns down my sides, memorizing me. Her touch was searing, deliberate, her hands mapping out the shape of me, claiming, worshipping. She kissed me like she had been waiting for this moment for a lifetime, like she had spent years forcing herself to look away, forcing herself to pretend, and now she couldn't anymore, neither could I. Her lips moved down the curve of my neck, sucking gently, then harder, leaving behind something I knew wouldn't fade easily, something I would feel for days. Her hands followed, slipping beneath the fabric of my dress, pushing it up inch by inch, teasing me, building the unbearable heat, curling low in my stomach. She pulled back just enough to look at me, her hair slightly disheveled, her lips red, swollen, desperate. "Tell me you want this," she whispered, voice hoarse-like. She needs to hear it, needing permission to ruin me completely. I arched beneath her, my fingers tightening in her hair, pulling her closer, letting my lips brush against hers in a way that made her shudder against me. "I want this," I breathed. "I want you." And then she lost whatever control she had left. Her hands slid lower, pushing fabric away, exposing me, bearing me beneath her touch. Her mouth followed, exploring, tasting, devouring, making me whimper, gasp, beg. She took her time, dragging it out like she wanted to savor every reaction, like she wanted to burn this moment into both of us. My nails scraped down her back, and she groaned against my skin, the sound vibrating through me, making my legs tighten around her. She was everywhere, her hands, her mouth, her body pressing into me, and I was falling, spiraling, drowning in her completely. She wasn't just my mother's best friend anymore. She was Vivian, The woman who had been in my life for years. The woman I had thought was untouchable. The woman who was now touching me in ways that made my entire body burn with wanting. And there was no turning back now. I had never expected this. I had never expected her. But tonight she made sure I knew. And she didn't stop there. Her mouth was everywhere, devouring, savoring, worshipping, as if she wanted to burn this moment into my skin, as if she wanted to make sure I would never forget how it felt to be touched by her. Her hands gripped my thighs, holding me in place as she descended, her breath warm against my most sensitive skin, her fingers following the curves of my body like she was committing me to memory. I gasped as she pressed her lips lower, slow and teasing, dragging out every second, making me shudder, whimper, beg. She chuckled against me, the sound vibrating through my body, making me arch into her touch, into her mouth, into the dizzying pleasure she was unraveling me with. I clawed at the sheets, my breath breaking into ragged moans, my body melting under her expert movements, her tongue and fingers working in perfect tortuous rhythm. She wasn't rushing. She was taking her time, owning me, keeping me on the edge until I was pleading, my body desperate for release. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take any more, she whispered against my skin, "Give it to me." And I did. I shattered. Beneath her I woke up slowly, my body sinking into the warmth surrounding me, the silk sheets cool against my bare skin. For a moment I was caught between dreams and reality, floating in that hazy place where nothing quite makes sense, where everything is just a little too soft, a little too surreal. But then as the room around me came into focus, as I became aware of the steady rise and fall of someone else's breath beside me, as the scent of jasmine and something distinctly her filled my senses, it all came crashing back. I was in Vivian's bed. My pulse skipped, my body still humming with the remnants of last night. I didn't move at first, afraid to break the stillness, afraid to face what this all meant. But I could feel her next to me, her presence just as consuming in the quiet morning light as it had been in the dark. I turned my head slowly, and there she was. She lay on her side, her hair slightly tousled, her expression softer than I had ever seen it before. She looked different now, not the woman who had always been untouchable, composed, guarded, but someone vulnerable, someone undone. And when she opened her eyes, it was there. No regret, no hesitation, something deeper. Her gaze moved over me, taking me in, memorizing me, as if she wasn't quite sure this was real. Then her fingers moved, trailing down my arm in a slow, lingering caress. "Do you regret it?" she murmured, her voice still thick with sleep, low and dangerous in a way that sent shivers down my spine. I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. Did I? Everything inside me screamed. No, last night had been madness. A collision of desire, restraint, breaking emotions, unraveling in ways neither of us had expected. But none of it felt wrong. If anything, it had felt inevitable. I shook my head slowly, my breath catching as her fingers traced along my wrist, her touch making it impossible to think straight. "No," I whispered. "I don't." Something in her eyes shifted, a quiet relief, a silent admission of something she wasn't saying out loud. I had spent so long thinking she was cold, thinking she was merely indifferent, unattainable. But now I realized she had never been any of those things. She had just been afraid. Afraid of wanting something she wasn't supposed to have. Afraid of looking at me and seeing what she wasn't allowed to see. But last night we had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. And in this moment, as her fingers continued their slow, intoxicating path down my arm, I knew neither of us wanted to go back. And yet, what happened now? Reality was pressing in, creeping through the cracks of this perfect, quiet morning, reminding me that this wasn't some fleeting affair, some mistake we could laugh about and forget. She was my mother's best friend, and I had spent the night in her bed, wrapped up in her arms, tangled in her sheets, in her world, in something neither of us could ignore anymore. As if she could sense the thoughts racing through my mind, she finally shifted, propping herself up on one elbow, watching me with that unreadable expression she wore so well. Her fingers drifted to my jaw, tilting my face toward hers, her thumb tracing over my bottom lip in a way that made my breath catch all over again. "You're thinking too much," she murmured. I let out a shaky laugh. "And you're not?" Her lips curved into a small, knowing smile, but her eyes held something heavier. "Of course I am," she admitted, her voice softer now, the weight of the morning finally settling between us. "I just don't know if I want to stop thinking about it." A beat of silence. A moment stretched too thin to fragile. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding. Then don't. Her eyes darkened, and for a second I thought she might kiss me again, pull me back into the world we had created last night. But then, just as quickly, she exhaled and sat up, her fingers slipping away from my skin, leaving me cold without her touch. She ran a hand through her hair, her expression unreadable again. "This can't be easy," she murmured, more to herself than to me. I pushed myself up onto my elbows, watching her carefully, suddenly afraid that this was the part where she took it all back. "Are you saying we should pretend it never happened?" I asked, my voice quieter than I meant it to be. She hesitated, and in that small pause I felt my chest tighten. Then she turned to me, and for the first time since waking up I saw it. She didn't want to pretend she wanted this. She wanted me. "No," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm saying I just don't know what will happen next." Neither did I. I didn't have the answers. I didn't know if this could ever be more than just one night, if we could ever exist beyond the secrecy, beyond the consequences that would come crashing down on us the moment someone found out. But I did know one thing. I wasn't ready to walk away from this. Not now. Not when I finally knew what it felt like to have her touch me, to have her want me, to have her look at me the way she was looking at me now. So instead of saying anything, I reached for her hand, threading my fingers through hers, squeezing gently. She looked down at our intertwined hands, then back at me, her expression unreadable again, but softer now, almost resigned. "This is dangerous," she murmured. I smiled just slightly, feeling the weight of her fingers against mine, feeling the warmth that hadn't faded even after everything. "I think it already was," I said. She exhaled a quiet laugh, shaking her head, but she didn't let go. And I knew then this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. But could I really let this happen again? Could she? Could we keep this hidden? Keep pretending we weren't crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed? I didn't have all the answers. But maybe you do. Let me know in the comments. And before you go, make sure to subscribe and hit that bell icon. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next.